English proficiency exams. What are they? IELTS, TOEFL, everything you need to know, the structure, the pricing, the format, the scoring, all of that and a lot more in this episode of Healthcare Heartbeat.
You are listening to Healthcare Heartbeat, brought to you by Avant Healthcare Professionals.
Welcome to another installment of Healthcare Heartbeat, a podcast produced by Avant Healthcare Professionals. Today, I am joined by Jennifer Rives. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank
You're
you.
very complimentary of what we've put together here.
Yes, I just love this wall. It looks
you.
fantastic.
There's a lot of work. In case you're watching or listening, this wall is a lot of work. Okay. Jennifer is a English program manager here at Avant Healthcare Professionals. And you've been with the company for over 3 years?
That's right.
Okay, good. This will be fun. And today what we're talking about are English proficiency exams. So let's start the most natural place to start. Why are those important? Why do our healthcare professionals watching or listening to this, if they're just starting their journey, right? Why is this an important thing?
That's a fantastic question. Yes, let's dive right into that, shall we? So yes, there is a reason that as part of the process, international healthcare professionals will be asked to take an English proficiency exam. So a couple reasons for this, the primary reason really being that the English proficiency exam is a required part of the U.S. immigration process. So that is actually a requirement that the federal government specifies.
So kind of a biggie.
Huge, in fact. Yes, you really can't get a visa.
You need it.
You kind of need it. Otherwise, you can't get the visa, essentially, right?
Yes. So an essential piece of the immigration puzzle.
Correct.
Got it.
That's one thing. And then the other thing I like to remind people about, too, when it comes to the English proficiency exam is really this is an opportunity for international healthcare professionals to develop their English language proficiency before arriving to the country where they're going to need to be ready to practice safe and effective patient care using only English, right? So this is really kind of an important step in that professional development process as well.
And there's two biggies in the space, right? So if you're out there, again, watching or listening, you may already know them, but they're the ones we're going to tackle today, IELTS and TOEFL. So at a real high level, we are going to dig in a lot deeper, but at a high level, what's the deal with these two tests, exams?
So the deal is these tests have been around for a long time in the English language testing space. So they're quite reputable and quite famous at this point. So in case you didn't know, IELTS stands for International English Language Testing System. That is the name of the full test. TOEFL stands for Test of English as a Foreign Language. And both of these exams, until just about 2022, were the only two English proficiency exams that were accepted as part of the U.S. immigration process. So they really are considered gold standard exams because they've been around for so long and they've been part of the process for so long.
And like I said, we're going to dive deep this episode, but just so I understand, both of these tests are accepted, as you said, by immigration. It's not that one or the other, because these both have been around for so long, they have the established. So both are accepted by immigration.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
Awesome. So I want to, before we jump into the kind of the nitty gritty of IELTS and TOEFL, I want to also just take a quick minute to talk about if you are a healthcare professional out there and you are wanting to work in the U.S., the type of support that Avant gives, right? As you start down that journey, right? Because we talked about this in a previous episode. We broke down the process, but it's a long process. Yes. So we're kind of talking about this whole English proficiency piece. How does Avant support our healthcare professionals?
That's a fantastic question. And I will say Avant gives a lot of support to its healthcare professionals. So here in the Avant English program, we take a really personalized and sort of one-on-one customizable approach when it comes to supporting nurses, occupational therapists, and physical therapists with the English proficiency exam. because we understand that, everyone learns language differently. People are coming and starting from different places when it comes to their English proficiency. So we really get to know people in our program and work with them one-on-one to develop a custom plan that meets their needs, right, in order to help them be successful on their English proficiency exam in the timeliest manner possible as part of their immigration process.
Yeah, and I want to say this, there's I'm not going to name any names, but many of our competitors may say that they provide this kind of support and they just kind of throw a textbook at you. It's like, all right, learn it. And I don't know about you, but I know I have many starting stops in Duolingo app to try to learn a second language. And I have not learned, the spoiler alert, I have not learned a second language yet. So I love that we provide honestly, the real and best way to support someone learning a new language, which is that one-on-one. It's a customized approach. I think we have the benefit of doing this for so long. Again, Avant's been around for over 20 years that we've learned over time. We at least maybe have a baseline, right? Like, okay, here's kind of the structure, but we know that everyone learns differently.
Exactly.
And that's where the one-on-one piece comes in. Are they struggling with this component, that component? And that's where you can dive in, spend a little more time, give a little more support in these areas versus these other ones, versus just saying, just go online and do this thing, right? So there's actual people who work with you. So really excited to dive deeper. So let's do that right now. And let's start with IELTS. Okay, IELTS. What does it stand for again?
International English Language Testing System.
It's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful.
Glad they gave it, glad they shortened it to IELTS. So let's talk about the format. Okay, what's the format of the IELTS exam?
Okay, so I'll try to keep this as high level as I can because we really can get boggled down in lots of detail when it comes to these exams. But essentially, the IELTS exam is comprised of 4 different subtests: listening, reading, writing, and speaking. The entire test takes about 2 hours and 45 minutes with all of the parts combined. And typically what happens when, you go for IELTS on test day is that you will be taking the exam in 2 parts. So one would usually sit for listening, reading, and writing first as sort of one part, and then speaking usually takes place separately. Sometimes it's on a completely different day from the listening, reading, and writing. Yes. Sometimes it is the same day. So, that's something you have to look at when you actually register for the exam. You have to check your dates, please. You want to make sure you show up on the right day.
Please note, check your dates.
Please note, check the dates. It is sad when people miss their test dates because
they didn't realize it's a 2-day.
Exactly.
It's a problem.
It's a problem.
Sure.
So we want to avoid that. But essentially, the 2 biggest tests that everyone wants to know about on both IELTS and TOEFL are speaking and writing. So, when it comes to the speaking test of IELTS, it's a 3-part test. So there's part 1, part 2, part 3. And the way it works is that part 1 is kind of like your introductory part to the exam. And it really is more so a quick conversation with the examiner on topics that you would be familiar with from your everyday experience. So for example, your country, your hometown, your job. And it's a very quick exchange. It's only about, 4 to 5 minutes long. So this part requires someone to speak, fairly concisely and quickly as sort of their intro to the test. Part 2 of the speaking test is when one is presented with a cue card. And on this card, there is a speaking prompt. And the person needs to really tell a story in response to that prompt. And they have to talk for 2 full minutes.
Wow.
Exactly. It's called the long turn because you talk for 2 full minutes nonstop.
My introverts out there are already shaking in their boots. But
Absolutely.
That's again, if you work with Avant, this is where we help you with this.
No problem.
But it's good to know going in. I can't imagine people going into this test blind.
Yes.
I can't imagine what a shock that would be.
This is why we don't recommend that. We definitely don't recommend going into the test blind.
Just jump in.
It's definitely better to
Don't do
practice
that.
and prepare for sure, because there are strategies for each part of the test that you need to practice and learn. That is something the Avant English Program provides support with, so we don't recommend people do anything blind when it comes to IELTS, and we are here to provide that support for nurses here at Avant. But then after you complete part 2, what's next is part 3. And really in this part, the examiner will ask additional questions based on the topic that was in part 2. And so these questions are longer. You need to answer them in about 45 seconds. So they're much longer responses. And they're usually about your opinion related to a subject. They want you to explain your opinion on certain questions and provide details and reasoning behind your opinions. That's really what they're looking for. So once you're done with all of these parts, the entire speaking test takes anywhere from 11 to 14 minutes in total.
Wow. Okay, so when we were chatting about this, you had also mentioned that there's kind of almost 2 types, right? And if I remember correctly, you can keep me honest, you're the expert, not me. Academic and general training. So what do people need to know about those 2 types?
Yes, great question. So these are exactly right, 2 different types or versions, we can say, of the IELTS exam. Now, for the U.S. immigration process, only one of these types is accepted, and that is the academic version of the IELTS exam.
That's good to know.
Yes. So for any international healthcare professional interested in coming to the U.S. as a USRN, you do need to take the academic form of the IELTS exam. So that is very important to note.
Note that.
Note that.
Yeah. Now, you do the test, right? How then does the scoring work in the IELTS? Because it sounds like there's kind of a lot of aspects of open-endedness, right? From the way you explained at least the 3 parts of the speaking part. So how exactly is this scored?
Yes, so there is a rubric. They're called the band descriptors in the IELTS language. And so the way IELTS is scored is it's a band system. There are 9 total bands. So the lowest is 0. Don't worry, you won't get that. That's only if you don't show up, right? So if you don't show up, it's a 0. But the highest of them is 9. And 9 is really like native speaker, fluent in the language level. Exactly. So what our healthcare professionals need to achieve is a 7 in their speaking. So that's an advanced level speaking score, and a 6.5 overall score on the band scale. And again, the highest of those bands is a 9. Now, for the speaking test specifically, the examiners will listen to the candidate speaking, and they have a set of criteria that they're listening for to determine how they're going to assign a score to that candidate. There's actually 4 different set of criteria that they're listening for. And so it's important to note that these examiners are highly trained. You know, IELTS is very good about training their examiners, and they regulate the scoring very carefully. That's why IELTS is a trusted exam. It's known very highly, you know, in the English language testing space. So they take great care to train and assess their examiners and make sure scoring is accurate as part of their processes for scoring. But these examiners are experts, right, in the English language. So they all have at least a master's degree, for example, in the subject of, you know, ESL assessment and teaching. So you can rest assured that these are very qualified, you know, and experienced people who are assigning scores. But that's essentially how the process works. And it would be 2 different examiners assigning a score for each candidate.
When you complete the exam, is there kind of an average turnaround of when you get your score? How does that work?
So that really depends on the type of the exam you take in terms of computer-based test or paper-based test. So that's an important feature of IELTS. It actually offers 2 different formats for testing. You can take the computer-based IELTS or the paper-based. Both are accepted for the immigration process. So it really doesn't matter. It's more of a personal preference there. But typically, when you take a computer-based test, you will get your scores much faster. You can get those scores within a matter of days. Whereas typically, if you sit for a paper-based test, you might be waiting up to 2 weeks to get your scores, which is quite long.
Yeah, that's a suspenseful, probably nail-biting 2 weeks for our healthcare professionals out there taking that. So, objectively speaking, with IELTS, what are the pros and cons?
I would say probably one of the biggest pros of IELTS is just the fact that, like we've been saying, it is so well known and well renowned. So when it comes to the immigration process and later on the placement process, which is part of, obtaining state level licensure, most state boards in the U.S. are very familiar with IELTS and very accepting of that already as part of their processes. So it's very established. You do have that assurance when selecting IELTS that you're pretty much golden for the entire USRN journey. So that's one pro, I think many nurses
Significant pro,
think.
I would say.
Pretty big.
It's known.
It's known. It's reputable.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something that nurses trust and boards trust and the federal government trusts. So you're getting that assurance. But the other big pro for many nurses that we find is the fact that there's a paper-based option when it comes to IELTS, because there are just some test takers out there who do not want a computer-based test. They're a little old school, like myself. I'm going to admit it. I'm a little old school. I would want a paper-based test, so I'm right there with any paper-based test takers. There's just something magical about flipping the pages, circling with your hand,
something magical. I love that you said there's something magical about it. I feel like you're speaking to like your tribe out there of viewers and listeners. It's like, you get it. The page turners who love the tactileness of the page.
We're still out there. We're still here. Okay, we're here. No, it's true. And so I know many test takers feel the same way I do. They feel they need that to be successful, and so that is an option that IELTS provides, whereas with TOEFL, that is not an option for you. You have to accept a computer-based test.
Oh, okay. So that might be if your team Jennifer on the paper test, it sounds like you are leaning in on IELTS for sure.
It's a good option.
So you mentioned TOEFL. Are you ready to now shift gears and talk a little bit about TOEFL?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's start where we started with IELTS and discuss the format of TOEFL.
Sure. So as I just mentioned, an important distinction between these two is TOEFL is entirely computer-based. There was a time in the past when there was a paper-based TOEFL, but that is phased out. You cannot get it anymore. It's gone.
And Jennifer's mad.
And they shouldn't have done that. No, I'm kidding. but whatever, they're all computer-based now. Okay. And so similar to IELTS, it's a 4-part exam with speaking, listening, reading, and writing. For the sake of comparison, I'll go ahead and just speak on the speaking test specifically because, again, with most test takers, it's usually speaking is the primary area of concern when it comes to an English proficiency exam. So with TOEFL, because it's computer-based, you're going to not be speaking with a person like you would for IELTS, right? IELTS is a face-to-face conversation with an examiner. Sometimes it is a video call, but regardless, you're going to be talking to a human being, right?
Yeah.
TOEFL is not. You are talking to the computer screen via microphone and headset, right? So you have to be okay with that. Some people find that unnatural.
Yeah, I was going to say, like with all of our healthcare professionals you work with, is there a mix? I assume there's a mix of, as stressful as it might be to talk to a person, it may be even more stressful just to talk to a screen, right? That's a big adjustment.
Some people do find it very stressful, yes. Myself included, I'm in that camp. I'm just going to say I would also probably prefer face-to-face a little bit. But we have nurses who are on the total opposite side, and they are not as comfortable seeing a face and seeing a human. And in fact, they prefer the computer-based nature because they feel they can actually more focus on what they're saying and what they're speaking. So that's an example of individual preferences, right? And just different test takers have different needs when it comes to their test. But the other interesting thing to note about TOEFL speaking compared to IELTS speaking is that on IELTS speaking, you're doing just that. You're focusing on your speaking, right? TOEFL as an exam is famous for what are called integrated skills tasks. So, for example, on the TOEFL speaking test, you will have one question where you're just speaking, right? And this is basically asking a test taker to express their opinion or their thought or their idea on a topic based on their experience. But you only get one question like that. The other 3 questions you will encounter on TOEFL speaking are integrated questions. So they will require the candidate to, for example, listen to something and then speak in response to what they heard.
Interesting.
There are 2 questions where a candidate has to read something and listen to something and then speak in response. So you could say that the TOEFL speaking is slightly more involved because it's using more language skills before you can actually give your response.
Wow. Okay. And I think the important thing to stress here is there's not necessarily, and this is why we wanted to do this episode, is to explain that there's not necessarily this is 100% this one, 100% that one. From the way you're explaining it, it sounds like a lot of it kind of comes down to preference.
Absolutely, it does. Yes. So, specifically for us here in the Avant English Program, we take that time to talk to nurses one-on-one and find out about those preferences and those areas of strength and potential, weaknesses or areas of opportunity. So we can sort of help guide people in the right direction when it comes to picking an exam that works for them.
See, obviously not to pat ourselves on the back too much, but that's a smart approach, right? Because these preferences, I think, are incredibly important to selecting the right exam for our healthcare professionals,
Absolutely.
Right? If the idea or thought of talking to a person in the context of your English exam, right? Because obviously they become a nurse. That's a human interaction job for sure. But, a new language, that's intimidating and that can be scary. And so that gets back to the one-on-one aspect,
yes.
Right? And being able, I think, to guide you on your best path to success, right? All right, so let's talk about scoring for TOEFL.
Sure.
How does that work?
So for TOEFL scoring, it is on a different scale. So we mentioned that for IELTS, it's a scale of 0 to 9. Bands is what it's called in IELTS speak. For TOEFL, it's so it's a little different. Each subsection gets a score of 0 to 30. So 30 is the highest one can score in one subsection on speaking, on listening, on reading, or on writing. And then overall, a candidate is given a score out of 120. Right? So when it comes to immigration, there are specific scores that a candidate must have on both tests. So I believe I mentioned for IELTS, those scores are 6.5 overall and 7 in speaking. For registered nurses, this is an important distinction because, for example, if you are an occupational therapist or a physical therapist, you cannot take IELTS, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Unfortunately, yes.
Interesting.
So
okay.
For occupational and physical therapists, TOEFL is very prevalent.
Yeah.
It's accepted for them.
Yeah. It's the only option you got, or at least
one of the only ones. There's very few.
One of these two, right? So, okay, that's an important, very important distinction. So with the scoring for TOEFL is when it comes to the immigration component, does it look at just the overall score, or do you also have requirements for each section? How does that work?
TOEFL is more specific in terms of its requirements. So really, there's an overall score requirement. So for example, for registered nurses, I want to say that the overall requirement is an 81. Now, there's also a requirement for speaking individually. So for registered nurses, it is currently 24. And that went down, actually, in 2022.
Wow.
They lowered that. It was originally 26.
Wow.
And they lowered it for nurses to 24.
Okay.
So that is a positive change that TOEFL made, right?
But that's still on, the high end of the scale, for sure.
These are definitely advanced level scores that candidates have to achieve with English training, of course, and support.
And just to reiterate, TOEFL and IELTS accepted, right? I know this is something we may mention it a bunch of times throughout this episode, but I do think it's important if you're just starting this journey to understand that both are, but of course, with some caveats. You had mentioned with the physical therapist, occupational therapists, TOEFL's the only option. So this is where making sure if you are going to go on at this on your own, which Avant's here to help you, so I don't know why you would, but you need to understand that you're not wasting a good amount of time, energy, and heaven forbid, money on the wrong exam.
Exactly.
You know, only to find out, oh, that's not accepted. And then you've invested again, time, money, resources, all this stuff. So that's just another feather in your cap, if you will, another advantage of working with Avant is we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. Right?
Exactly, right.
So, all right, objectively, pros and cons, TOEFL.
Objectively, pros and cons of TOEFL. I'd say, again, the pro is the same pro that we mentioned already for the IELTS, which is just the fact that it is so widely known and accepted, not only on the immigration level, but also at the state board level when it comes time for, licensure, and working with a hospital. So that's not a concern to have at all in that area. And then I'd also say the other pro would just be, if you are a strong computer-based tester, and we do have a lot of test takers who really want that from an exam. So I do want to mention that. I know I said earlier, I'm a paper-based person, but I don't want that to color, anything here. I want to be totally non-biased and objective.
Don't worry, Jennifer. I would still go with the computer option. So
there you go.
We all got our preferences.
We all do.
Sure.
And so for my really strong computer-based test takers out there, this is a solid computer-based test. Again, it's been around for so long. You can just trust that it is, been assessed and looked at several times. Scoring procedures are accurate. The test really is something you can trust when you go to take it, and it gives you that computer-based element, right? So if you, do prefer, for example, you don't like speaking face-to-face to a person, I totally get that. During a test, it's very intimidating for some people to do that. It does psych people out, and it does hurt performance, actually. If you get psyched out during a speaking test, it can be really difficult to recover from that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And you mentioned, I think it's important to, again, bring it up in this section. I don't necessarily know if it falls in pros and cons, but it's an important consideration. Occupational therapists and physical therapists.
For occupational and physical therapists, TOEFL is one of the only exams that is actually acceptable.
See, that's why we do this show, because even I don't know, and I'm in it. So I understand the confusion.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's very confusing.
Fantastic. Anything else that I think is, when it comes to pros and cons of TOEFL, that you can think of?
I'd say the only other thing I can think of is just the integrated skills piece. Again, with TOEFL, it's not just on the speaking test where you will find those things. During the writing test, you will have to listen, for example, to an audio and read a passage before you can write something.
Wow.
So these integrated skills tasks are very prominent on TOEFL. That could be a potential con for someone if you're feeling that that's overwhelming. And some test takers do. Some test takers feel like they're brain dead a little bit after TOEFL just because they have to juggle all these skills. Others don't feel that way. Others are like, whatever, bring it on, right? Yeah. It just depends on you. But if that sounds like something you're like, I want something more streamlined, like give me just listening, give me just reading, writing, maybe IELTS is a better fit.
A little more direct. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to do kind of a head-to-head comparison real quick, and we're going to talk about maybe the biggest consideration for many of you out there, and that's the cost for each of these. So stick around, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Are you tired of dealing with staffing shortages in your healthcare facility? Let Avant Healthcare Professionals help. Our partnership provides skill-matched, globally educated healthcare professionals who provide positive patient experiences and exemplary clinical quality. In fact, over 90% of our healthcare professionals convert to our clients' full-time staff. Too good to be true? It isn't. Here are just some of our satisfied clients.
It's a win. It's a win for us because we were able to, help with, our staffing needs, but we were also able to add value to our team of nurses that are there. we have a diverse team of nurses that are available to take care of patients that speak a different language. It just really adds value.
Why would you not hire a nurse from Avant? They brought extraordinary heart and soul to our unit and our facility.
So what are you waiting for? Go to avanthealthcare.com/podcast or click the link in this episode's description to start the process in solving your staffing problems. Avant Healthcare Professionals.
So we're back as we talk about English proficiency exams for healthcare professionals. Well, I guess for anyone, but obviously we're speaking to our healthcare professionals, hopefully future U.S. healthcare professionals out there. And I wanted to hit two things that we haven't hit yet, and they're important when we're talking about IELTS and TOEFL. And the first is test centers and availability, because there's a lot of factors, and we're going to summarize these at the end, right? But this is a huge factor. Talk about it.
Yes, this is a huge factor because, of course, Avant, supports nurses from over 70 countries in the world, right? And so when it comes to availability of test centers, it really is location and country dependent, right? And so this is a very important point to note for anyone listening out there is, you really want to take care before you commit to an exam to make sure that exam is actually going to be available in your area, right? In your specific region in your country. Because unfortunately, certain tests are not as readily available in certain parts of the world. So I'll give an example of this. For example, we often find that in the Caribbean, TOEFL tends to be more widely available in general than the IELTS exam for whatever reason. I don't know why exactly that is per se, but it is true that TOEFL tends to be more widely available. So typically for nurses in the Caribbean, they tend to gravitate towards TOEFL because although they may still have to travel for their exam, and this is true, oftentimes nurses in the Caribbean do have to travel from island to island to sit for TOEFL. But the overall cost of that travel will be much less traveling within the Caribbean than if you had to travel to the U.S. to sit for IELTS. And so that's where things can get really tricky because, unfortunately, like I said, IELTS is not as readily available. So if you want to sit for the IELTS coming from the Caribbean, you might have to look at traveling as far as the U.S. to sit for an exam and paying for your flight, your accommodation, all those things just to sit for IELTS. So that's why we always recommend, before you put in that time and effort to study for something, check the availability on the test website first, just to make sure that exam is actually going to be there.
And I just want to reiterate, that doesn't mean, so again, using the example of the Caribbean, doesn't mean that IELTS is out.
No.
But what it does mean is you need to be prepared and understand that it may be more involved or may be more travel and subsequently more cost, which we're going to get into here in a second, to take that test.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And so, again, going in and knowing and being prepared so that, if you were that nurse in the Caribbean and you're like, okay, I want to do IELTS, and you do all that preparation and then only discover, oh man, I can't travel, I can't afford that, or I can't do that. It's more challenging for me. That sets you back, right?
It really, yes, it can create some big delays in people's immigration timelines and processes, which sadly we have seen before, and that's just an outcome we want everyone to be able to prevent for themselves because, that's really, we feel so sad when that's the thing that causes a delay in someone's immigration process, right? So just proper, checking first is really going to be the thing that helps mediate that. So, that's my big takeaway there.
I again encourage anyone watching this to go back to our episode about the process to understand all the components of, getting from where you're at now to becoming a nurse in the U.S. And, there is a good amount of uncertainty.
Yes.
But this is why Avant, what we do is to minimize as much of the uncertainty as possible. We can't eliminate it. We really can't, because there's a lot of components that are out of our control, out of your control, right? But there are a lot that are under our control, or are things that we can be aware of, or are things that, again, in our 20 years of doing this, we're like, we know, hey, this is coming. Let's figure out a way to get past it. Let's figure out a way to expedite. Let's figure out a way to move through this as quickly as possible. So, these are components that, working with Avant Healthcare Professionals, we can't necessarily make these tests go faster, but everything that's within our control, we work with you on. And so the burning question, I'm sure, for many of our listeners and watchers is the cost of these tests, right? Maybe after listening to this episode so far, they say, oh, I'm really leaning towards this one or that one. These tests have individual costs, but before we even get into those, I want to hit the variable which is tied to availability.
Yes.
Right?
That's
and the
correct.
cost that could come from that.
That is correct. So yes, as we just mentioned, these test centers, depending on where you are located in the world, you may have certain test centers near to you and you may not. So another example I can give is that in certain regions of the world, typically, in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on, Middle East as well, IELTS tends to be very readily available. And there tend to be test centers in most people's locality, right? So the overall travel cost then of going to a test center that is near to you will be much lower because
it's the difference of a cab ride, taxi ride versus a flight.
Correct. That is what we're talking. Considerable cost. But unfortunately for other people, depending on where you are, your closest IELTS test center or TOEFL test center or any test center maybe 4 hours away, 8 hours away, an entire plane ride. And unfortunately, that means the cost would be much higher there because you do have to arrange for a flight, like you said.
Yeah. Okay. So what about the cost of the tests themselves?
Yes. So the actual costs for each exam, they're pretty comparable overall. Typically, the IELTS will tend to be a little more expensive, but not by a crazy amount. So the current range I was able to dig up online. But again, it's important to note that costs vary by location, right? So a nurse taking IELTS or TOEFL in Ghana, for example, will not pay the same cost as a nurse taking the exam in the Philippines. Okay. Yes, all costs vary by your actual location, but a general range for them, IELTS is typically around $250 US. It can go up to 310. That is the highest I've heard so far, is about 310 US dollars for IELTS. Okay. TOEFL tends to be a little lower on average. So typically 250 is more the maximum end for TOEFL. And I've heard it as low as 210 US dollars. So you could be looking at a savings of maybe 40, 50 US dollars if you go with TOEFL. For some, that's significant savings. And for others, it's maybe not so significant, or maybe it's not the factor for them that'll have them choose that test. But they're approximately the same, with TOEFL tending to be slightly cheaper.
So here's how I want to wrap up. Thank you, folks, for you're just such a wealth of information on this, which is amazing. But I want to summarize with, for those of you, again, out there listening, watching, the factors. When you're sitting down deciding between TOEFL and IELTS, and these are kind of the, if you're going to make a spreadsheet, if you will, it's like, this is how, it's like, I'll put an X in this column or something like that. And so I want to go through them at a really high level and kind of keep me honest here, right? So the first one is, I guess, like, if you have a preference, a computer preference.
Yes,
right?
That's a big one.
Right. So, and again, to recap, well, you better recap because I'm going to mess it up.
Sure.
So if you have a computer, if you'd like to do it on the computer, right, which one would you choose on that one?
You can either do the computer-based IELTS or you can do TOEFL. Okay. Great news. You actually have two options there.
Great. Availability. And this one is not a right or wrong answer. Well, I guess it's a which one can you support? Almost like kind of financially, like is one test center more readily available, closer for you, right? So that's another category, is availability in area.
Absolutely.
Right? Physical test centers.
Absolutely.
Third one, which we didn't hit on yet, but I'm glad we're doing it here, is test time.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So what's the difference between these two tests when it comes to test time?
Sure. So yes, this is important because these are big tests.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who has ever taken one of these English proficiency exams will tell you it's a tiring experience. When you leave those tests, you're pretty exhausted after that. You just use so
we've been
much
talking
brain
for about
power.
for a while, and I'm going to need a nap after this. So I get it.
Exactly.
And in English is my first language.
Right.
So I can appreciate that if you're doing this, that it's and this isn't, I'm not on the hook for immigration, right? Like it's like I can understand completely that an hour, whatever the time is, those hours are stressful. They're exhausting.
They're exhausting. And so test time does matter because, I always recommend people really think about these things and plan for these things, knowing what you know about your energy levels during an exam,
totally.
right? So IELTS typically lasts about 2 hours and 45 minutes in total, right? So almost 3 hours.
And you had mentioned, just to bring it back, IELTS was the one that potentially could be split over 2 days.
Correct.
Right? So
Yes.
just note that if you're looking at that, right?
Yes,
so
good point.
I don't know if that's an advantage or not. Some people are kind of like, I want to just get it over
done.
with in one go versus do half of it, stress about it, and then have to come back the next day.
Most people, from my experience, tend to be the former. They kind of be like, I just want to get it done. Let me, let me do it both. But so yes, excellent point. Now, TOEFL actually used to be really long. It used to be 4 hours long.
Wow.
But guess what? In 2023, actually, it was last year, TOEFL totally rebranded and changed its test, and now it's half the time. It is only 2 hours long.
Oh my goodness.
They cut back a lot of
That
stuff.
is significant.
They did. They changed their entire writing test to make it shorter. So they made their test only 2 hours long now. So that is a big advantage.
Okay, good to know. I love your point also on like energy levels of when you sound like I'm a big like if you know first thing in the morning that is not like don't schedule the test for that, right? Or get a lot of coffee or soda or whatever your caffeine kick is. And now the other piece that you had mentioned when we're talking about these is the writing component.
Yes.
Right? And that there's kind of a differentiation between them. So explain that.
Yes, exactly. So the writing component on both of these tests is quite different. So the way it works on the IELTS exam is that it is 60 minutes total for the writing test. So you have to be, again, mentally prepared for 1 hour of writing. You will have 2 tasks on IELTS. So a task 1 and a task 2. Now, task 1 is all about interpreting an image, right? And describing in writing the trend you see in the image. And that image could be a chart, it could be a graph, it could be a table. You have to be prepared to look at data, essentially, and interpret that via writing. And that's only 20 minutes, right? Okay. This is a short task. You want to get that done within 20 minutes. Now, the thing that keeps people awake at night when it comes to IELTS writing is task 2, because that's an essay. That is an academic 4-paragraph essay. Must have an intro paragraph, must have a conclusion, 2 body paragraphs on an academic topic. And that's the thing that some people struggle with when it comes to IELTS writing.
Okay. That keeps people up at night.
Keeps people up at night.
That keeps, I think, most students up at night, the idea of the essay.
The idea of the essay. It's here for IELTS. It's strong.
Okay. The IELTS brings it. Its essay game is strong.
Its essay game is real strong.
Okay.
So that is just something to note with the IELTS. And so that takes preparation, right? You got to prepare for that kind of a writing task. You need to practice your essay writing skills, it's part of the package. Now, TOEFL actually used to have an essay as well. But again, when they changed their format in 2023, they took away the essay.
Oh.
Can you believe that? They were like, hey, students don't like the essay. Let's get rid of that.
What?
Right? And so now the writing test, what they replaced it with, in case you're interested, is actually an academic discussion task.
Oh, okay.
And so what that looks like is, I don't know if, during your college years, if you ever experienced an online discussion forum from a professor in a college course, That is what this task is on TOEFL.
Wow.
Exactly.
That's a shift.
It is a big shift. So it really is like a prompt in which a professor will pose a topic in an online discussion forum, and the test taker has to produce a written response to that post from the professor.
Okay.
And it's only 10 minutes long, and it's all typing.
Okay.
So some people really like that task, and they find it very friendly.
The trade-off being
approachable.
there is it's not an essay, but you can't necessarily, it sounds like, prepare as much for it, right?
Yes.
Because the essay is the essay on a subject or topic that you choose?
No.
Oh, it's not. They give it to you.
They do.
Oh,
so
okay.
for both of them,
Interesting.
it's kind of like for both of them, it's
There's an
given to
unknown
you.
factor.
There's
Okay.
always an unknown.
Okay.
But I'd say when it comes to the IELTS writing task, because it's been the same for so long, there's so many resources, and the strategies are well known. The types of questions and question types, you can practice for. So personally, this is my personal opinion, is just that there's a little more out there when
Okay.
it comes to that writing
Of
already.
course.
TOEFL writing, it's new, right? It just came out a couple months ago in 2023. So there's some information online and some tips and tricks for that task. But when you just compare the wealth of information there, the
Got it.
IELTS writing task has more information out there. But again, an academic discussion is a very friendly forum, and we find a lot of test takers like that task, actually. And, they find the way that TOEFL structures it, they are able to get ideas to write a response in the 10 minutes.
So the last factor in consideration is also the cost.
Yes.
Right? And so you had mentioned, generally speaking, keep me honest here, IELTS, generally speaking, is a little more expensive
Generally, yes.
than TOEFL.
Correct.
Right? Depending on your region, depending on your area. So these are the factors: the computer preference, availability, test time, the writing component, and the cost. And really where your preferences lie on those may at least help to guide you to the best option for
Absolutely.
you. So I want to end this episode with some tips. This is what you do every day, all day long. Well, not all day long, but during every day with our healthcare professionals. What are some tips? What are some things that if someone's out there, healthcare professionals out there watching this, listening to this, what are some tips that they can take away when preparing, I guess, for either of these tests or to go into a English proficiency exam?
Absolutely. I think my greatest tip and my number one, if you take no other tip away from this episode, would simply be, before committing to an exam, right? Be that IELTS or TOEFL, do first an honest assessment of yourself and your current abilities in the English language, right? As well as in just English testing in general. So, where are your strengths in these areas? Where are your weaknesses? What do you really need from an exam in order to be successful? Really spend some time first to take stock on that and do some self-reflection on that. Because once you understand what you need, you can then pick the exam which has the format that's going to match you at your needs and your preferences. So that truly is step number one. I feel it's a step you cannot miss, right, as part of this process. So that's my biggest tip to start.
Maximize your strengths and kind of, I don't want to say shield, but like kind of minimize your weaknesses.
Exactly
right.
right.
The test that lines up the best.
Exactly right.
We've hit it a lot, but I got to believe that availability is probably another tip that you would have.
I would. So my second tip would be, these exams, you have to invest some pretty significant time and energy to prepare for them, right? And so before you start investing that time and energy, my advice is go online to the websites of these exams and check for the availability in your area first, right? That way you know that after you've completed all that study and preparation, you will be able to, smoothly travel for your exam and sit for your exam, right? Be that in a car or taxi or be that in an airplane, right?
Totally.
But you'll have done that research ahead of time, so you'll know up front that you can actually commit to sitting for the test, right? Before you begin all your preparation.
And I think the last thing that we had discussed as far as an important tip for anyone that's considering these English proficiency exams is the exact reason why we did this episode for you. And that is, don't go in blind.
Yes. Never a good idea to go into an English proficiency exam without studying. I will say that. Remember, these are complex tests. There are a lot of strategies that need to be utilized. You do need to be familiar with the types of questions you're going to be asked. You need to know what examiners are looking for when they're assigning scores to you, so you know what to do, right, during your speaking and your writing test. There are a lot of things to learn in order to be successful on these exams. So yes, it's really important to understand that up front and to be proactive in terms of finding ways to balance work and study, right? So, I recommend for anyone out there, if you haven't already started thinking, hey, how can I take my work schedule and my busy life schedule and find time for study within this schedule? Now's the time to start doing that, right?
Yeah.
Really take stock of what your weekly schedule looks like and find pockets of time to integrate that study into your life, right?
Absolutely.
Easier said than done. I know, trust me, we know very well. Here in the Avant English Program, that is something we help with as part of our personalized, one-to-one approach, is helping people to do that, because we know nurses are so busy, but just juggle so much.
Yeah, between work life, family life, and then let's not downplay just personal time.
Absolutely.
It's important. And we appreciate and understand that healthcare professionals, kind of like anyone else, it's about juggling those three things. And then you now throw in an English proficiency exam. So making it work. But if it's not on the calendar, if it's not on your calendar, then it's probably not going to get done.
Exactly. Right.
You have to make it tangible and real. So if you are a healthcare professional out there kind of going this alone and you want to work in the US, now is the time to go to AvantHealthcare.com and learn more about what we do, right? We help healthcare professionals throughout the entire process. So this English proficiency exam is just one piece, essential piece of the puzzle. And we are there all the way. So again, I encourage you to go to our website, AvantHealthcare.com, learn more about what we do, and apply. Right? We talked about this in a previous episode. Applying doesn't mean that you are committing, but it's making, again, that tangible first step. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything that we missed? I can't imagine there's anything we missed, but is there anything else?
All I want to say is, it is the English proficiency exam, definitely not an easy part of the process by any means, but you can do this, right? It's important to know that. Remember that there have been hundreds, thousands of healthcare professionals before you who have done this and made it possible with Avant, and you can be one of those people too. All it takes is a little bit of planning, like we said, little bit of that self-reflection time and understanding of what you need, and of course, communication, right? Just being open and honest about what you need and the help you need. And if you can do those things, there's absolutely no reason you can't do it too and be successful.
Yeah, we believe in you, and we are here to help you change your life and change the lives of patients and healthcare facilities here in the U.S. So with that, we will close this episode. We want to thank you for listening, watching, wherever you are. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This has been Healthcare Heartbeat by Avant Healthcare Professionals, the leader in international healthcare staffing and recruitment, where we change the lives of healthcare professionals every day. To learn more about how our healthcare professionals can help your facility, visit AvantHealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts.